My grandmother called me a bastard for 30 years. Turned out I was her only real grandchild. Growing up, I thought it was normal that Grandma Rose treated me different from my cousins. At Christmas, my cousins would get expensive toys and electronics while I got socks or a $5 bill in a used envelope. My cousin Brittany got a laptop for her 10th birthday. I got a library card application form. Grandma said reading was free and I should be grateful. My cousin James got a car for his 16th birthday. I got a bus pass. When I asked why, Grandma pulled me aside and said I was lucky to be included at all since my parents had me in sin. She said I was a mistake that reminded everyone of my parents' shameful behavior. I was conceived 3 months before my parents got married. Grandma never let anyone forget it. She'd introduced me as the grandchild who came early while my cousins were her precious angels. At family dinners, my cousins ate at the dining table while I ate in the kitchen. Grandma said I should know my place. My mom tried defending me once. Grandma threatened to cut my parents out of the will entirely if they didn't respect her rules about maintaining family values. Dad told me to just deal with it for a few more years. He said Grandma was old-fashioned, but she'd mellow out eventually. She never did. She got worse. When my cousins graduated high school, Grandma threw them huge parties and gave them college funds. Brittany got $50,000. James got $60,000 because he was a boy and would need to support a family someday. When I graduated as valedictorian, Grandma didn't even come. She said academic achievements didn't erase the circumstances of my birth. I got nothing for college. I worked 2 jobs to pay for community college while my cousins went to private universities on Grandma's money. Brittany studied art history and failed half her classes. James dropped out sophomore year to become a DJ. Grandma kept paying for their apartments and expenses. She said they were finding themselves. When I got into nursing school on a scholarship, Grandma said I was trying to act better than my station. The favoritism extended to everything. Grandma took my cousins on yearly cruises. I wasn't invited because she said I'd make the family photos look unbalanced. She bought my cousins cars, paid for their weddings, gave them down payments for houses. When I asked for $100 to fix my broken radiator in winter, she said handouts would make me lazy. She literally said I needed to learn that bastards don't get blessings. My Aunt Laura and Uncle Richard never said anything. Why would they? Their kids were getting everything. They'd actually joke that I was Grandma's character-building project. They'd laugh about how their kids had it so easy while I had to struggle for everything. They thought it was funny that I worked nights to pay for textbooks while Brittany bought designer purses with her allowance. Everything changed when I was 28. Grandma had a stroke and needed someone with medical knowledge to manage her care. Suddenly, I was useful. The cousins who she'd spoiled couldn't be bothered to help. Brittany was busy with her 3rd wedding. James was in Thailand finding himself. Again. My aunts and uncles said they had work, so I became Grandma's caregiver. Not out of love, but because Mom begged me. While managing Grandma's affairs, I found some old documents in her safety deposit box. DNA tests from 20 years ago. Grandma had secretly tested all her grandchildren because she had suspicions about her children's faithfulness. The results were shocking. Brittany and James weren't biologically related to Grandma. Neither were my other 4 cousins. Uncle Richard wasn't Grandma's biological son. He was the product of my grandfather's affair. Aunt Laura wasn't Grandma's biological daughter either. She was adopted, but Grandma never told her. My dad was Grandma's only biological child. I was her only biological grandchild. The woman who'd tortured me for 28 years over being conceived before marriage had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on grandchildren who weren't even related to her while treating her only real grandchild like garbage. I kept this information to myself and kept being the perfect caregiver. I made sure Grandma took every medication. I drove her to every appointment. I cooked her special meals. I did everything while my cousins posted beach photos from their vacations funded by Grandma's money. Grandma recovered enough to update her will. She gathered everyone to announce her final wishes. The Monday after I found those DNA tests, Grandma Rose called me into her bedroom. She sat propped up against 3 pillows, looking stronger than she had in weeks. She said she wanted to update her will and needed the whole family present this Saturday for the reading. I nodded and made notes about calling everyone while my stomach twisted into knots. She asked if I thought the family would be surprised by her decisions. I told her I had no idea what she planned to leave anyone. She smiled this cold little smile that made my skin crawl and said they'd all find out soon enough. My cousins would probably expect their usual handouts, the kind of money that had always flowed their direction while I got library card applications and lectures about knowing my place. I spent that week taking care of Grandma Rose like always, helping her with medications 3 times a day, and cooking the bland meals her doctor recommended. Every time she complained that her pills were too big or the soup was too hot, I thought about those DNA tests sitting in her safety deposit box. I'd memorized every detail on those lab reports. Uncle Richard, not her biological son, but the product of Grandpa's affair with someone whose name I'd never know. Aunt Laura, adopted at birth but never told the truth. Brittany and James, my spoiled cousins who weren't actually related to any of us. The 4 other cousins, also genetic strangers who'd been showered with college funds and cars and cruise vacations. And me, the only real grandchild, the one she'd called a bastard for 28 years. Wednesday afternoon, while I fluffed her pillows for the 3rd time, Grandma Rose told me I'd done a good job as her caregiver. She said most people would have abandoned her after the stroke, but I'd shown real character. I wanted to laugh at the irony, but I just smiled and adjusted her blankets. Thursday night, my phone rang while I was folding laundry in my tiny apartment. Brittany's name flashed on the screen and I almost didn't answer. She asked if I could pick up Grandma Rose's favorite pastries from that bakery across town for the will reading on Saturday. She was too busy with her wedding planning to make the drive herself. The wedding Grandma Rose had given her $40,000 to pay for, while I'd gotten a bus pass for my 16th birthday. I said sure, no problem. Still playing the role of family servant, even though I knew I was the only actual grandchild in this whole mess. Brittany thanked me and then spent 10 minutes talking about centerpieces and whether she should do a chocolate fountain. She didn't ask how I was doing or if taking care of Grandma Rose was hard. She never did. I hung up and added the bakery to my list of errands, right below picking up Grandma Rose's prescriptions and taking her blood pressure monitor in for calibration. Saturday morning arrived cold and gray. I drove to Grandma Rose's house early to help her get ready. She'd insisted on wearing her best dress, the navy blue one with pearl buttons that she saved for special occasions. I helped her into her wheelchair and did her makeup the way she liked it, with too much powder and bright red lipstick. She kept checking her reflection in the mirror and adjusting her hair. At 11, the family started arriving. Uncle Richard came first with his wife, both of them dressed like they were going to a fancy restaurant. Aunt Laura showed up next with her husband, carrying a bottle of expensive wine. My parents arrived looking uncomfortable, Dad tugging at his collar and Mom gripping her purse too tight. Then came the cousins, all 6 of them dressed up and excited. Brittany wore a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. James had on a new suit that still had the tag tucked inside the collar. The 4 other cousins clustered together near the window, already whispering about what they hoped to get. We all gathered in Grandma Rose's formal dining room, the same room where I'd eaten alone in the kitchen as a child, while my cousins laughed and talked at the big table. The room had dark wood paneling and a crystal chandelier that Grandma Rose polished every month. Family photos covered one wall, mostly pictures of my cousins at their graduations and weddings. I appeared in maybe 3 photos total, always in the back corner or cut off at the edge. My cousins took seats at the table, spreading out and claiming space like they owned it. Brittany sat next to James and they were both grinning, already planning how they'd spend their inheritances. I heard Brittany whisper something about finally buying that condo in Miami. James laughed and said he'd probably take a year off to travel Europe. The 4 other cousins were making similar plans, talking about paying off student loans and buying new cars. At 11:30, a woman in a gray suit arrived carrying a leather briefcase. She introduced herself as Maeve Wilkinson, Grandma Rose's estate attorney. She looked about 50 with sharp eyes and perfectly styled hair. When she shook my hand, she held my gaze for a few seconds longer than necessary, like she was trying to figure something out. I wondered if she knew about the DNA tests, if Grandma Rose had told her the truth about this family. Maeve set up her papers at the head of the table while everyone found their seats. I ended up in the chair closest to the kitchen door, the same spot I'd always occupied during family dinners. Some things never changed, or at least they hadn't changed yet. Grandma Rose wheeled herself to the head of the table, looking stronger than she had in months. Her hands were steady on the wheelchair controls, and her voice didn't shake when she started talking. She thanked everyone for coming and said she had important announcements to make about her estate. Then she turned to me and said something that made the whole room go quiet. She thanked me for taking such good care of her after the stroke, for managing her medications and driving her to appointments and making sure she ate properly. She said I'd shown real dedication, and she appreciated everything I'd done. My cousins stared at me like I'd grown a second head. Grandma Rose had never publicly acknowledged anything I'd done before, never praised me in front of the family. Aunt Laura's eyebrows went up and Uncle Richard shifted in his chair. Mom reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. Maeve Wilkinson opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. She explained that she'd be reading Grandma Rose's last will and testament, updated just 2 weeks ago. She started with small bequests to various charities and organizations, $5,000 to the church, $10,000 to the local animal shelter, $20,000 split between 3 different cancer research foundations. My aunts and uncles shifted in their chairs, clearly impatient to get to the real announcements about property and money. Uncle Richard kept checking his watch. Aunt Laura poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table and drank it too fast. The cousins were getting restless too, whispering to each other and glancing at Grandma Rose. Maeve looked down at her papers and announced that Brittany would receive Grandma Rose's jewelry collection. The whole collection, including the diamond necklace and the emerald ring and all the gold bracelets, worth about $30,000 total. Brittany squealed and jumped up to hug James. She was already talking about which pieces she'd wear to her wedding and which ones she'd save for special occasions. James hugged her back and said she deserved it. Grandma Rose smiled and nodded like she'd just done something wonderful. I sat in my chair by the kitchen door and kept my face blank, thinking about all the times Brittany had gotten expensive gifts while I got $5 in a used envelope. Maeve continued reading and announced that James would receive Grandma Rose's vintage car collection. 4 cars total, including a 1967 Mustang and a 1972 Corvette, worth roughly $80,000 altogether. James actually whooped and pumped his fist in the air. He was grinning so wide I could see his back molars. He started talking immediately about which car he'd keep for himself, and which ones he'd sell to fund his Europe trip. Grandma Rose told him to take good care of the Mustang because it had been his grandfather's favorite. James promised he would and thanked her about 5 times. My parents sat stiff in their chairs, not looking at each other. Then Maeve announced that the 4 other cousins would each receive $25,000 plus various household items from Grandma Rose's house. They smiled and thanked her, but I could see the disappointment on their faces. They'd clearly expected more, probably hoped for 6 figures like they'd gotten for college. They glanced at each other across the table with these tight little expressions that said they were trying not to show how let down they felt. One of them asked about the beach house in Florida, and Maeve said that property was allocated elsewhere. Another asked about the investment accounts and got the same answer. The 4 cousins settled back in their chairs looking pleased enough but nowhere near as excited as Brittany and James. Maeve cleared her throat and looked down at her papers before announcing that Aunt Laura would receive the beach house in Florida. The words hung in the air for a second before Aunt Laura gasped and covered her mouth with both hands. Maeve continued that the property was valued at approximately $400,000, and Aunt Laura started crying right there at the dining table. She stood up and walked over to Grandma Rose's wheelchair, bending down to hug her carefully around the shoulders. Aunt Laura kept saying thank you over and over, her voice shaking with emotion. She pulled back and wiped her eyes with her fingers, smearing her mascara a little. She told Grandma Rose that she'd been such a generous mother, the best mother anyone could ask for, and she didn't know how to express her gratitude. Uncle Richard reached over and squeezed Aunt Laura's hand when she sat back down, both of them looking pleased and a little stunned. My cousins were whispering excitedly to each other about beach vacations and family trips. I stayed quiet in my chair, watching Aunt Laura dab at her eyes with a tissue someone passed her. Maeve shuffled her papers and announced that Uncle Richard would receive Grandma Rose's investment portfolio. She explained that the portfolio contained various stocks and bonds valued at approximately $600,000. Uncle Richard's eyes went wide and he actually stood up from his chair, nearly knocking it over backward. He walked around the table to Grandma Rose and bent down to hug her, holding on for several seconds. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet, and he told her she was the best mother anyone could ask for, that she'd always been so good to him and his family. He said he'd manage the investments carefully and make sure they continued to grow. Grandma Rose patted his hand and told him she knew he would, that he'd always been responsible with money. Uncle Richard walked back to his seat looking dazed and happy, and his wife grabbed his arm and squeezed it tight. The 4 other cousins were leaning forward in their chairs now, clearly hoping their parents would get something substantial too. My mom shifted in her seat next to me, and I could feel her tension without looking at her. Maeve looked at her papers again and announced that my parents would receive $50,000 and some furniture from the house. She listed a few specific pieces, including the antique dining table from the guest room and the grandfather clock in the hallway. My dad's face went tight and uncomfortable, like he was trying to smile but couldn't quite manage it. Mom reached over under the table and squeezed his hand hard, her knuckles going white. They both nodded and thanked Grandma Rose in these quiet, strained voices. Nobody else seemed to notice how awkward it was because Uncle Richard was still grinning about his $600,000, and Aunt Laura was already planning her Florida trips out loud. My parents sat there holding hands and looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. I watched Dad's jaw clench and unclench while Mom stared down at the table. They were used to this, used to being the lesser recipients in this family, used to watching everyone else get more. $50,000 was nothing compared to what the others were getting, and the furniture felt like an afterthought. Maeve paused and looked directly at me. The room went completely quiet. Everyone turned to stare at me sitting in my chair by the kitchen door. I could feel their eyes on me, could practically hear them thinking about what tiny amount I'd get. Brittany had this little smirk on her face like she was trying not to laugh. James was looking at me with something that might have been pity. The 4 other cousins just looked curious, waiting to see what would happen to the family disappointment. Aunt Laura had stopped crying and was watching me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Uncle Richard was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. My parents were both staring at Maeve, waiting to hear what token amount their daughter would receive for being conceived before marriage. Grandma Rose was looking at me too, her face completely blank. The silence stretched out for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 seconds. I kept my face neutral and my hands still in my lap. Maeve announced that I would receive Grandma Rose's primary residence. She said the house we were sitting in, this exact house, would be mine. She added that the property was worth approximately $1.2 million. The room exploded. Brittany actually screamed and James jumped up from his chair. Uncle Richard started shouting something I couldn't make out over everyone else's voices. Aunt Laura was saying no, that couldn't be right, there must be some mistake. The 4 other cousins were all talking at once, their voices rising and overlapping. My parents sat frozen in their chairs, staring at me with their mouths open. Brittany was yelling that this was insane, that I didn't deserve anything, let alone the house. James was demanding to know what was happening, looking back and forth between me and Grandma Rose. Uncle Richard's wife was saying something about legal challenges and fairness. The noise was unbelievable. Everyone shouting questions and protests and confused exclamations all at the same time. Maeve raised her voice and said there was more. The room didn't quiet down. She had to say it again louder before people started to settle back into their chairs, still muttering and shaking their heads. Grandma Rose was sitting perfectly still in her wheelchair, watching everyone with this satisfied look on her face. Maeve continued that I would also receive Grandma Rose's main bank accounts. She said the accounts totaled roughly $800,000. Before anyone could react to that, Maeve added that I would also receive the remaining investment properties, which included 3 rental houses worth approximately another $1 million combined. The total inheritance was around $3 million. The room erupted again, even louder this time. Brittany was screaming about manipulation and theft. James was pacing back and forth behind his chair. Aunt Laura was crying again, but this time from anger, her face red and blotchy. My cousins were all on their feet now, surrounding Maeve's chair and yelling over each other. Brittany got right in Maeve's face and demanded to know how I'd tricked a sick old woman into changing her will. Maeve sat calmly and told her to step back. James was shouting that this wasn't fair, that he'd been Grandma's favorite for years, and now suddenly, I got everything. The 4 other cousins were demanding explanations, asking what made me so special, saying this had to be illegal somehow. Aunt Laura pushed her chair back and stood up, pointing at me with a shaking finger. She said I'd manipulated Grandma Rose during her stroke recovery, that I'd taken advantage of a vulnerable woman who couldn't think straight. She called me calculating and cruel. Uncle Richard was already pulling out his phone, saying he was calling his lawyer right now to contest the will. He told Maeve this wouldn't stand up in court, that there was clear evidence of manipulation and undue influence. His face was purple and he was sweating through his shirt. I sat completely still in my chair while chaos swirled around me. I watched my cousins yell and my aunts cry and my uncle make angry phone calls. I saw my parents sitting frozen and confused, not understanding what was happening or why. I waited for the right moment, the perfect moment, knowing it was coming. Grandma Rose raised one shaking hand in the air. The gesture was small, but everyone saw it. The room started to quiet down bit by bit, voices dropping to murmurs and then to silence. Grandma Rose looked around at all of them with this expression on her face that I'd never seen before. She told them there was more they needed to hear. Her voice was steady and clear, stronger than it had been in weeks. She said they needed to sit down and listen, because what came next would change everything they thought they knew about this family. Maeve reached into her briefcase and pulled out more documents. These were different, older looking, in manila folders that were worn at the edges. I felt something cold settle in my stomach because I recognized those folders. I'd seen them in the safety deposit box. Maeve set them on the table in front of her and opened the first one carefully. The room was dead silent now, everyone staring at those folders like they might explode. I realized with absolute clarity that Grandma Rose knew about the DNA tests. She'd known all along that I'd found them. This whole will reading was her final game, her last twisted manipulation. She'd planned every second of this, from the inheritance amounts to the timing of the revelations. She'd set up this entire situation to watch the family implode. I looked at her face and saw satisfaction there, saw pleasure in the chaos she'd created. She'd been playing us all for 20 years, maybe longer. Grandma Rose spoke again and said she'd had all her grandchildren DNA tested 20 years ago. The room went completely silent, so quiet I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. She said she'd suspected infidelity in her family for years, and finally decided to find out the truth. My cousins' faces drained of color. Brittany sat down hard in her chair, her mouth hanging open. James grabbed the back of his chair like he needed it for support. The 4 other cousins looked at each other with panic in their eyes. Aunt Laura made this small, choking sound. Uncle Richard's phone slipped out of his hand and clattered on the table. Maeve pulled out papers from the folder, actual lab reports with official letterhead and test results. She set them on the table where everyone could see them. Nobody moved to pick them up. Nobody wanted to touch them. They all just stared at those papers like they were poisonous snakes. Grandma Rose looked straight at Uncle Richard and told him he wasn't her biological son. She said his real father was the man Grandpa had an affair with 30 years ago. The room exploded all over again. Uncle Richard jumped up from his chair so fast it fell backward and hit the floor. He started yelling that she was lying, that this was impossible, that she was making things up to justify her crazy will. His face turned bright red and spit flew from his mouth as he shouted. His wife just sat there frozen with her hands gripped tight on the edge of the table. Her knuckles were white and her mouth hung open. She looked like someone had hit her in the head with something heavy. The other family members started talking all at once, voices getting louder and louder until it was just noise filling the whole room. Grandma Rose waited for the shouting to die down a little bit before she kept going. She said there was more they needed to know about Aunt Laura. Her voice was calm and steady, like she was reading a grocery list instead of destroying people's lives. She told everyone that Aunt Laura was adopted at birth. She said she never told Laura because she wanted to see if blood really mattered, or if love could make up for it. Aunt Laura made this awful choking sound and started crying. Tears ran down her face and she kept asking how Grandma could keep this secret for 50 years. She asked how her own mother could lie to her every single day of her life. Her voice got higher and shakier with each question. She grabbed onto the table like she might fall over without it holding her up. Maeve pulled out more papers from the folders and set them on the table. These showed that Brittany and James weren't biologically related to the family either. The DNA proved that Uncle Richard's wife must have had affairs because her kids didn't match Uncle Richard or anyone else in the family. Brittany's parents started screaming at each other right there in front of everyone. Her dad called her mom names I won't repeat. Her mom threw her water glass at him and it hit the wall behind his head. Water and ice went everywhere. James just sat there looking at his hands. He didn't say anything or move or even seem to be breathing. His face had gone completely white like all the blood had drained out of it. Grandma Rose kept talking through all the chaos. She explained that the other 4 cousins also failed the DNA tests. She said both her children had raised kids who weren't theirs. She told them the entire family structure they'd believed in their whole lives was built on lies and affairs and secrets. The dining room felt like it was getting smaller with all the yelling and crying. People were standing up and sitting down. Someone knocked over a chair. Aunt Laura was still sobbing. Uncle Richard was pacing back and forth making angry phone gestures even though he didn't have his phone in his hand anymore. I finally found my voice. My hands were shaking, so bad I had to press them flat against my legs under the table. I asked Grandma Rose why she tortured me for 28 years if she knew I was her only biological grandchild. I asked why she made me eat in the kitchen while fake grandchildren ate at her table. I asked why she called me a bastard when I was the only real family she had. My voice came out steady even though I felt like I might throw up. The room went completely silent. Everyone turned to stare at me. Some of them looked confused like they were just now understanding what this all meant. Some of them looked angry like this was somehow my fault. Grandma Rose met my eyes across the table. She didn't look away or seem embarrassed or show any guilt at all. She told me she wanted to see if I'd turn out weak like my father or strong enough to earn what was rightfully mine. She actually called it a test of character. She said I passed by taking care of her despite everything she'd done to me. She said it like she expected me to thank her. She said it like she'd done me some kind of favor by treating me like garbage my entire life. Her face showed she really believed what she was saying. She thought she'd been helping me somehow. I stood up from my chair. My legs felt wobbly, but I made myself stay upright. I told Grandma Rose that her test was cruel. I said it damaged me in ways she would never understand or care about. I told her I didn't want her twisted approval. I said I didn't want her trying to justify decades of emotional abuse by pretending it was some kind of lesson. I said the money didn't make it okay. Nothing could make it okay. My voice got louder as I talked and I didn't try to stop it. I'd been quiet for 28 years and I was done being quiet. Dad finally spoke up. He'd been sitting there silent this whole time, but now he turned to face his mother. He asked her how she could know he was her only biological child, but still watch her favor children who weren't even related. He asked how she could let him watch his daughter get treated like trash while fake grandchildren got everything. His whole body was shaking. I'd never seen him this angry in my entire life. He stood up too, and his chair scraped loud against the floor. He told his mother she'd made him choose between his child and his inheritance, and he'd chosen wrong. He said he'd never forgive himself for that, and he'd never forgive her either. Grandma Rose waved her hand at Dad like she was brushing away a fly. She said she gave me everything in the end, so he should be grateful instead of complaining. She told him the outcome was what mattered, not the journey. She actually used those words like this was some kind of inspirational story instead of child abuse. She said I got the house and the money, and that proved she loved me more than anyone. She didn't understand that money can't undo 28 years of being called a bastard. She didn't care that you can't erase decades of making a child feel worthless. Her face showed no understanding at all of what she'd actually done. Uncle Richard's wife started crying. Not the angry crying that Aunt Laura was doing, but this broken, hopeless kind of crying. She admitted through her tears that she'd had an affair with her personal trainer 15 years ago. She said it only happened a few times, but apparently those few times were enough. She looked at Brittany and James and said she was sorry. Uncle Richard started yelling at her, calling her terrible names. She yelled back that he'd been having affairs for years, so she didn't feel bad. Other family members jumped in, taking sides. Someone brought up something that happened at a Christmas party 8 years ago. Someone else mentioned a business trip that seemed suspicious. The whole family was fracturing right there at the dining room table. Arguments and accusations flew in every direction. People were crying and shouting and pointing fingers. It was complete chaos. I grabbed my purse from the floor near my chair and stood up. My legs shook, but I made them work. The shouting behind me got louder as Uncle's wife started screaming about all his business trips to Miami. I walked through the dining room doorway into the hallway. The front door was maybe 20 feet away. I could hear glass breaking in the dining room, probably someone throwing something. A woman in a dark suit was standing by the coat rack. She had gray hair pulled back tight and carried a leather briefcase. She stepped forward and held out a business card. The card said Maeve Wilkinson, estate attorney. She told me I'd need legal help for what was coming. Her voice was calm, like families didn't explode at will readings every day. I took the card and shoved it in my purse. She nodded once and walked back toward the dining room. I kept going to the front door. Outside, the air felt cold and clean after being in that house. My car was parked on the street 3 houses down. I got in and locked the doors. My hands were shaking too hard to put the key in the ignition. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes until they stopped shaking enough to drive. The first lawyer called on Tuesday morning while I was at work. I was checking a patient's IV when my phone buzzed. The voicemail said he represented Uncle and his wife. They wanted to contest the will based on Grandma's mental state. The second call came that afternoon. This lawyer worked for Aunt. She was claiming undue influence and demanding the will be thrown out. The third call came Wednesday. This one represented all 6 cousins together. They said Grandma wasn't thinking clearly when she made these decisions. I called Maeve after the third message. She answered on the second ring. I told her about the 3 lawyers. She said she expected this and asked if I could come to her office tomorrow. I said yes. She gave me the address and told me to bring any documents I had from Grandma's safety deposit box. I went home after my shift and pulled out the DNA tests. The papers were old and crinkled. I spread them on my kitchen table and read through them again. Each test showed the same thing. Not related, not related, not related. Only mine said biological match. I put them in a folder and set it by the door so I wouldn't forget. Maeve's office was in a tall building downtown. The waiting room had leather chairs and paintings of boats. She came out to get me herself. Her office had a big desk and windows overlooking the city. She asked to see the DNA tests. I handed her the folder. She read through each page slowly. Her face didn't change at all. When she finished, she looked up and asked if anyone else knew I had these. I told her no. She said that was good. Then she asked if I knew her husband Keith. I said I didn't. She explained that he was a private investigator who specialized in estate cases. She said I needed to hire him to document everything about Grandma's medical condition. We needed proof she was completely aware of what she was doing when she updated the will. I asked how much it would cost. She wrote a number on a piece of paper. It was a lot, but I had savings from working all those years. I told her okay. She picked up her phone and called someone. She said Keith could start tomorrow. Keith looked nothing like I expected. He was short and round with a friendly face. He met me at a coffee shop near the hospital. He had a notebook and asked me questions for 2 hours. When did Grandma have her stroke? What medications was she taking? Did she ever seem confused? Did she recognize people? Could she make her own decisions? I answered everything. He wrote it all down. Then he asked for permission to access Grandma's medical records. I signed the forms he brought. He said he'd have preliminary findings in a week. 6 days later, he called. He wanted to meet again. This time we met at his office. He had papers spread across his desk. He showed me Grandma's medical file. She'd had the will updated exactly 2 weeks before the reading. The same day she met with a psychiatrist for 3 hours. The psychiatrist did a full evaluation. Memory tests, logic tests, comprehension tests. She passed everything. The report said she was completely mentally sound and understood exactly what she was doing. Keith found another document. Grandma had written a letter to the psychiatrist explaining why she wanted the evaluation. She said she knew her family would challenge her will. She wanted proof that she was making these choices while fully aware. She'd planned every detail. She knew there would be a fight and she prepared for it. She wanted me to have everything and she made sure no one could stop it. Someone knocked on my apartment door on Saturday morning. I looked through the peephole. It was Brittany. Her face was red and swollen from crying. Her hair was a mess. She wasn't wearing makeup. I'd never seen her without makeup before. I opened the door. She pushed past me into the apartment. She stood in my living room and started crying harder. She said her parents were getting divorced. Her dad moved out yesterday. Her wedding was canceled. Her fiancé broke up with her when he found out about the DNA tests. Everything in her life was falling apart. She asked if I knew about the tests. I closed the door and locked it. I told her yes. I found them months ago in the safety deposit box. She stared at me. Her mouth opened. She asked why I didn't tell anyone. Why I let everyone walk into that will reading without warning them. I walked past her to the kitchen and got a glass of water. My hands were steady now. I wasn't the one shaking anymore. Brittany followed me into the kitchen. She said I was selfish. She said I should have warned them. She said I let them all get blindsided because I wanted revenge. I turned around and looked at her. I asked if she remembered the Christmas when I was 12. She looked confused. I reminded her. The year she got a new laptop and I got a $5 bill in a used envelope. Did she say anything? Did she question why Grandma treated me different? Brittany's face went red. I asked about all the family dinners where I ate in the kitchen while she sat at the table. Did she ever speak up? Did she ever say it wasn't fair? I asked about the time Grandma called me a bastard right in front of everyone at Thanksgiving. Brittany was sitting 3 feet away. She heard it. She looked right at me. Then she looked down at her plate and kept eating. Brittany started crying again. She said she was just a kid. She said she didn't know what to say. I told her she was 26 now. She'd had 14 years to say something. She never did. She took the money and the gifts and the trips. She never questioned it once. Now she wanted me to feel bad for not protecting her from the truth. I told her to leave. A message appeared on my phone Tuesday night. It was from someone named James Turner. The profile picture showed my cousin. The message said he wanted to talk if I was willing. He said he understood if I didn't want to hear from him. He said he was sorry. He said he knew sorry wasn't enough, but he didn't know what else to say. I stared at the message for a long time. All my other cousins had been sending angry messages through their lawyers. James was the only one who contacted me directly. I typed back that we could meet. He suggested a coffee shop on Thursday afternoon. I said, okay. James was already there when I arrived. He sat at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He stood up when he saw me. He looked different from at the will reading. Smaller somehow. Tired. He gestured to one of the cups and said he got me a regular coffee but wasn't sure how I took it. I sat down. He sat across from me. He said he was sorry, not for the will, for everything before, for taking the car when he was 16 and never thinking about why I got a bus pass, for going to private school on grandma's money while I worked 2 jobs, for all the cruises and parties and gifts. He said he always felt guilty, but he didn't know what to say. He was scared if he said something, grandma would get mad at his parents. He was scared he'd lose everything, so he stayed quiet and let it happen. Now he knew that made him part of it. He was returning the car collection. All 4 cars. He was giving them back to help settle the estate fairly. He said it wasn't enough, but it was something. I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup. It was warm. I told him thank you. He was the first person in my family who'd actually apologized for anything. My apartment buzzer rang Friday evening. I pressed the button and asked who it was. Dad's voice came through the speaker. He said Mom was with him. They needed to talk to me. I buzzed them up. They came to the door and I let them in. Mom looked worried. Dad looked worse than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were red. His clothes were wrinkled. He walked into my living room and just stood there. Then he started crying. Not quiet crying. Loud, broken sobbing. Mom put her arm around him, but he pulled away. He turned to me and said he was sorry. He said he should have protected me. He should have stood up to his mother years ago. He should have taken me and Mom and left. He chose wrong. He picked money over his own daughter. He let me suffer because he was too weak to lose his inheritance. He said he'd never forgive himself. Mom was crying now too. She said they both failed me. They should have fought harder. Dad dropped onto my couch. His whole body shook. I sat down next to Dad. I put my hand on his shoulder. I told him I forgave him. The words came out easier than I expected. I meant them. He looked up at me with wet eyes. I said I forgave him, but I needed time. We couldn't just go back to normal. We had to build something new. Something better. He nodded. He said he understood. He said he'd wait as long as it took. Mom came over and hugged me. She held on tight. She said she was proud of me. Proud I survived Grandma's cruelty. Proud I came out stronger instead of broken. Proud I was still standing when everything fell apart. I hugged her back. My apartment felt smaller with all 3 of us in it, but it felt safer too. Like maybe something good could come from all this mess. My phone buzzed Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for work. A text from Aunt Laura. She wanted to meet for coffee that afternoon. She said it was important. I stared at the message for a long time. After everything she'd said during the will reading, after she'd called me manipulative and accused me of taking advantage of a sick woman, she wanted to meet. I almost deleted the text. But something about the way she wrote it made me curious. It wasn't angry or demanding. It just said she needed to talk. I texted back that I could meet her at 3. She sent back a thank you. I spent my shift at the hospital distracted, wondering what she wanted. Maybe she'd found a new angle to contest the will. Maybe she was going to yell at me again. I got to the coffee shop early and ordered a regular coffee. I sat at a table near the window where I could see her coming. She arrived exactly at 3. She looked different from the last time I'd seen her. Smaller somehow. Tired. She had dark circles under her eyes and her clothes looked wrinkled. She ordered tea at the counter and then came to sit across from me. She wrapped her hands around her cup and didn't say anything for a minute. Then she pulled an envelope from her purse. Inside were old papers, yellowed with age. Adoption papers. She said she'd found them in Grandma Rose's documents when she was going through things. Her whole life had been a lie. 50 years of thinking she knew who she was, and it turned out she didn't know anything. She asked if I'd help her find her biological family. I told her I would. She started crying then, quiet tears running down her face. She said she'd said terrible things during the will reading. She knew that. She was processing 50 years of lies, and she'd lashed out at the wrong person. She asked if I'd help her understand what I'd found in the safety deposit box. I agreed because she seemed genuinely broken. Not angry anymore. Just lost. We spent an hour going through what I knew. The DNA tests, the dates, the results. She took notes on a napkin with shaking hands. A thick envelope arrived at my apartment Thursday morning. Return address showed Uncle Richard's attorney. I opened it standing in my kitchen. Inside was a formal letter demanding I return half the inheritance. The letter said that even though he wasn't biologically related to Grandma Rose, he'd raised me as family. He'd been present at birthdays and holidays. He'd treated me like his niece. That should count for something in terms of inheritance rights. I took a photo of the letter and sent it to Maeve. She called me back within an hour. She said Uncle Richard's claim had no legal standing. His lack of biological connection combined with his complicity in my mistreatment eliminated any potential claim. She'd already drafted a response. I could hear her typing while we talked. She said not to worry. These kinds of desperate attempts were common when people realized they'd lost. She'd handle it. I hung up and made myself dinner. The letter sat on my counter like garbage I needed to take out. My email pinged Friday evening. A joint message from the 4 other cousins. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. They said they didn't blame me for their parents' mistakes. They were hurt and confused, but they remembered times I'd helped them with homework or covered for them when they'd stayed out too late. They appreciated that I'd never taken my anger out on them. The message was short and simple. No demands, no accusations, just acknowledgement. I wrote back thanking them. I said I was sorry they were caught in the middle of this mess. It wasn't much, but it was something. Keith called me Monday morning with an update on his investigation. He'd found something in Grandma Rose's documents, detailed journals spanning decades. He said I needed to see them. I met him at Maeve's office that afternoon. The journals filled 3 large boxes. Keith had marked certain pages with sticky notes. He handed me the first one. Grandma Rose's handwriting covered every page in neat blue ink. She'd documented everything. Every Christmas gift disparity. Every birthday party I wasn't invited to. Every cruise. Every car. Every check she'd written to my cousins while giving me nothing. She'd recorded the exact amounts, the dates, the occasions. She'd written down every time she'd called me a bastard or reminded me of my place. It was all there. Years and years of intentional cruelty, documented like a scientific experiment. Keith said she'd been creating a record of the favoritism, almost like she wanted proof of her own cruelty. I flipped through page after page. My hands started shaking. Maeve brought me water. I kept reading. I took the journals home that night. I couldn't stop reading them. One entry from 15 years ago explained everything. Grandma Rose wrote that she resented me because my parents' premarital pregnancy had embarrassed her in front of her church friends. They'd whispered about her son's shame. They'd looked at her differently. She'd decided to punish me for their sin. She wrote that she knew I was her only biological grandchild. The DNA tests had confirmed it. But that didn't matter. What mattered was teaching me that sin had consequences, that bastards born in shame didn't deserve blessings. She'd written it so casually, like she was describing a recipe. I closed the journal and sat in the dark for a long time. The next journal was worse. Grandma Rose had suspected the affairs and DNA issues for years before she'd actually tested everyone. She'd had her doubts about Uncle Richard since he was a teenager. She'd known Aunt Laura was adopted because she'd been there when her husband had brought the baby home, but she'd kept funding all of them. She'd kept giving money and cars and college tuition to grandchildren who weren't related to her. She'd chosen to keep punishing me specifically because of her twisted sense of morality. It wasn't about blood. It was about shame. About making sure I never forgot the circumstances of my birth. She'd written that my success despite her cruelty proved she'd been right to test me, that I'd turned out strong because she'd been hard on me. The logic was insane. Cruel. I wanted to throw the journals across the room, but I kept reading because I needed to understand. 3 months passed. The legal challenges all got dismissed. Maeve called me on a Tuesday afternoon to tell me it was officially over. Grandma Rose's psychiatric evaluations proved she'd been completely competent when she'd made her decisions. The detailed journals showed intentionality. Every judge who'd reviewed the case had ruled in my favor. Uncle Richard's attorney had withdrawn. Aunt Laura had stopped contesting. It was done. I thanked Maeve and hung up. I sat in my apartment looking at the paperwork spread across my coffee table. $3 million, a house, investment properties, all mine. I should have felt happy. Instead, I just felt tired. I listed Grandma Rose's house for sale the next week. I couldn't live there. Every room held painful memories. The kitchen where I'd eaten alone while my cousins laughed at the dining table. The living room where I'd opened $5 bills in used envelopes while they'd unwrapped laptops and jewelry. The driveway where James had gotten his car while I'd clutched a bus pass. The real estate agent said the house would sell quickly. Good location. Well maintained. She was right. I had 3 offers within a week. I accepted the highest one, $1.3 million after fees. Combined with everything else, my total assets were around $3 million. I signed the papers and handed over the keys. I never went back. The nursing home called me on a Thursday. Grandma Rose wanted to see me. Her health had declined rapidly after the will reading. The stress had been too much. She'd been moved to a facility with full-time care. I hadn't visited. I hadn't planned to. But something made me curious about what she possibly had to say now. I drove to the nursing home that afternoon. The hall smelled like disinfectant and old flowers. A nurse led me to Grandma Rose's room. She was in bed, smaller than I remembered. Thinner. Her skin looked paper thin. She turned her head when I walked in. Her eyes were still sharp despite everything else failing. She gestured for me to sit in the chair next to her bed. I sat down and waited to hear what she wanted. She started talking about her childhood. Her father had been a minister who believed pain made people better. He'd beaten her with a belt when she got bad grades. Made her kneel on rice for hours when she talked back. She said shame was how you learned right from wrong. She'd raised her own kids the same way until social services got involved and she had to stop. But with grandkids, she could do what she wanted because their parents didn't push back. She looked at me with watery eyes and said she thought she was building my character, making me tough enough to survive in a world that punished weakness. She actually believed the cruelty had been good for me. I sat there listening to her justify 30 years of abuse with twisted logic about character building. When she finished, I told her the truth. She hadn't made me stronger. She'd made me wounded. Every time I succeeded at something, it was despite what she'd done to me, not because of it. I worked 2 jobs through college because I had no choice, not because hardship built character. I became a good nurse because I'm naturally compassionate, not because she taught me anything about caring for people. I told her I hoped she found peace with whatever she needed to tell herself. but I couldn't give her forgiveness. That wasn't something she got to have just because she was dying. I stood up and walked out of her room. It was the last conversation we ever had. The nursing home called 2 weeks later on a Sunday morning. Grandma Rose had died in her sleep. Heart failure. The nurse said it had been peaceful. I hung up the phone and sat on my couch staring at nothing. I should have felt relief or satisfaction or something clean and simple. Instead, I felt this weird mix of anger and sadness that didn't make sense. She'd tortured me my whole life, and I'd never get to hear her actually apologize or admit she was wrong. Part of me had wanted that closure even though I knew I'd never get it. The funeral was on a Thursday. I wore black and sat in the back row of the church. My cousins filled the front rows with their families. Uncle Richard gave a speech about what a devoted mother Grandma Rose had been. Aunt Laura cried into a tissue. Everyone pretended we were a normal family having a normal funeral. Nobody mentioned the DNA tests or the will or the fact that half of us weren't speaking to each other anymore. I watched them all perform this fake unity and felt completely disconnected from the whole thing. After the service, everyone gathered in the church basement for coffee and sad sandwiches. I was getting ready to leave when James walked over. He looked tired. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking since everything happened. He'd returned the car collection to the estate like he'd promised, and now he wanted to do something meaningful with that money. He was setting up a scholarship fund for students from difficult family situations, kids who had to work their way through school like I did. He asked if I'd help him set it up since I knew what it was like. I looked at him and saw genuine regret in his face. I told him yes. It was the first thing anyone in my family had asked me to do that actually felt worthwhile. Dad called me the next week asking if I wanted to have dinner. Not a family dinner with everyone, just him and me. We started meeting every Tuesday at this diner near my apartment. The first few times were awkward. We talked about work and weather and anything except Grandma Rose. But slowly we started having real conversations. He told me he was seeing a therapist to work through his own childhood. Grandma Rose had been cruel to him too in different ways. He'd spent his whole life trying to earn her approval and never getting it. He said he understood now why he'd failed to protect me. He'd been too damaged himself to stand up to her. It didn't excuse what happened, but it helped me understand. We were both victims of the same woman in different ways. Aunt Laura sent me a Facebook message 3 months after the funeral. She'd done one of those DNA ancestry tests trying to find her biological family. The results had connected her with a woman named Jessie who turned out to be her birth mother. Jessie had 3 other kids, which meant Laura had 3 half-siblings she'd never known about. They'd all met up, and apparently they were really welcoming. Laura said it was weird having this whole new family at 50 years old, but they were kinder to her in 3 months than Grandma Rose had been in 50 years. She thanked me for not hiding the DNA results, even though finding out the truth had been painful. She said sometimes painful truths were better than comfortable lies. I took some of my inheritance money and paid off my student loans in one payment. $30,000 gone just like that. Then I paid off my parents' mortgage. I drove to their house on a Saturday and handed Mom the paid-off deed. She started crying and said I didn't have to do that after everything they'd put me through. I told her I wanted to. They'd made mistakes, but they were still my parents, and I loved them. Dad hugged me and cried too. It was the first time I'd seen him cry since I was a kid. The rest of the money I invested in boring index funds and bonds. My financial advisor wanted me to do something exciting, but I told him I just wanted security. I kept working at the hospital because I actually loved being a nurse. The money was nice to have, but I didn't want it to change who I was. I still drove my same car and lived in my same apartment. Financial security felt good, but it was quiet, not flashy. It didn't erase 30 years of being treated like garbage, but it meant I'd never have to worry about fixing a broken radiator in winter again. 6 months after Grandma Rose died, Brittany reached out asking to meet for lunch. I almost said no, but curiosity won. We met at a cafe downtown. She looked different. Less makeup, simpler clothes. She said she'd been in therapy working through a lot of stuff. She wanted to apologize for real, not just say sorry to make herself feel better. She admitted the favoritism had damaged her too in different ways. She'd never learned to work for anything or handle disappointment. Her 3 marriages had failed because she expected everything to be easy, like it had been growing up. She said watching me succeed despite having nothing had made her realize how weak she'd become. We talked for 2 hours. It didn't fix everything, but it was honest in a way our family had never been before. I started volunteering at a family counseling center that specialized in complicated inheritance disputes and family conflicts. Once a week, I'd go in and talk to people dealing with situations like mine. Families torn apart by money and favoritism and secrets. I shared my story and helped them figure out their options. Turning all that pain into something useful felt meaningful. Like maybe Grandma Rose's cruelty could at least help other people avoid the same damage. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was something. Uncle Richard never reached out after the funeral. No apology letter arrived in my mailbox. No text message asking if we could talk. His lawyer sent one final threatening letter about contesting the estate distribution, but my attorney sent back documentation that shut that down permanently. I checked my phone for weeks afterward, part of me still hoping he'd acknowledge what happened. He never did. His silence taught me something important about closure. Some people will never admit they were wrong. They'll never apologize for standing by while you suffered. They'll never take responsibility for benefiting from your pain. Waiting for that acknowledgement from Uncle Richard was like waiting for rain in a desert. I could stand there forever and die of thirst, or I could accept reality and find water somewhere else. I stopped checking my phone for his messages. I stopped rehearsing what I'd say if he ever apologized. I let go of needing his validation because he was never going to give it. That acceptance felt like setting down a heavy backpack I'd been carrying for miles. James started texting me every few weeks asking if I wanted to grab coffee. The first time felt awkward. We sat across from each other at a cafe downtown, both of us stirring our drinks and avoiding eye contact. He asked about my work at the hospital. I asked about his music projects. The conversation felt stiff and formal, like we were strangers trying to be polite. But we kept meeting. Once a month turned into twice a month. The awkwardness faded as we stopped trying so hard. He told me about his therapy sessions and how he was working through guilt about the favoritism. I shared stories about my nursing school struggles that I'd never told anyone. We discovered we both loved terrible action movies and started having movie nights at his apartment. He introduced me to his girlfriend, who was kind and genuine and treated me like I mattered. We built something real that had nothing to do with Grandma Rose or inheritance money or family obligation. James became the cousin I'd always wanted but never had. He was proof that some family relationships could be repaired if both people did the actual work. A year after Grandma Rose died, I went condo hunting with a real estate agent. I'd been living in my same small apartment, but I wanted something that felt like mine. Something I chose. Something with no painful memories attached to the walls. The agent showed me a place on the 4th floor with huge windows that let in morning sunlight. It had an open kitchen, hardwood floors, and a balcony overlooking a park. I walked through the empty rooms imagining my furniture, my books, my life filling the space. I made an offer that same day. The closing process took 6 weeks. I signed papers transferring ownership and got handed keys that unlocked a door to a place that belonged completely to me. I spent weekends painting walls the colors I wanted. I bought furniture that matched my taste, not hand-me-downs from relatives. I hung artwork that made me happy. Every choice was mine. No one told me the living room should be beige because that's proper. No one said I was being too flashy or acting above my station. The condo became my sanctuary, a physical space that proved I'd survived and built something beautiful from the wreckage. Dad called me on a Tuesday night and asked if he could come over. He showed up at my new condo carrying takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. We ate on my balcony watching the sunset. He told me he'd stopped talking to Uncle Richard entirely. They'd had a huge fight where Dad finally said everything he'd held back for decades. Uncle Richard had called him weak for siding with me over family unity. Dad had told him there was no family unity worth preserving if it required sacrificing his daughter. He'd also limited contact with Aunt Laura to occasional text messages. She kept trying to act like nothing had changed, wanting to pretend the DNA revelations and will reading never happened. Dad said he couldn't do that anymore. He was choosing me and Mom over keeping peace with siblings who'd enabled my mistreatment. It was the first time in my life Dad had prioritized me over family harmony. He apologized again for all the years he'd told me to just deal with it. I told him I forgave him, and I meant it. We sat on that balcony until the stars came out, talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding our relationship one honest conversation at a time. I met someone at the hospital during a particularly brutal night shift. We were both working in the emergency department when a major car accident brought in 6 patients at once. I was running between rooms managing IVs and medication, while this other nurse handled trauma assessments with calm efficiency. We worked together for 3 hours straight, communicating with just glances and quick gestures like we'd been partners for years. Afterward, we collapsed in the break room and he introduced himself. His name was Jonathan. He had kind eyes and a quiet confidence that felt comforting instead of arrogant. We started talking during breaks, then having lunch together in the cafeteria. He told me about his complicated family situation. His parents had divorced badly when he was young, and he'd spent years navigating loyalty conflicts and manipulative dynamics. He understood that healing wasn't a straight line. You didn't just fix family damage and move on. You carried it with you and learned to live with the weight. We started dating 3 months after that first shift together. It felt different from my previous relationships. Healthier. He didn't try to fix me or rush my processing. He just existed alongside me, patient and steady, while I figured out who I was becoming. James and I had been working on the scholarship fund for months. We'd set up the legal structure, created an application process, and promoted it through high schools in our area. We wanted to help students from difficult family situations who needed financial support for college. The application asked them to write essays about overcoming family challenges. We received 47 applications that first year. Reading them broke my heart and filled it at the same time. These kids had survived abuse, neglect, favoritism, abandonment. They'd worked jobs to support themselves. They'd studied in homeless shelters and cars. They'd fought for education while their families told them they weren't worth the effort. We selected 3 recipients and awarded each of them $10,000. The award ceremony was small, held at a community center. I watched these 3 students accept their checks with tears in their eyes. One girl talked about working night shifts at a gas station to pay rent after her parents kicked her out. One boy described being his younger sibling's primary caregiver, while maintaining a perfect GPA. One student shared about being the first in their family to pursue college despite being told they were wasting their time. I I saw myself in every single story. I cried through the entire ceremony. James squeezed my hand and whispered that Grandma Rose's money was finally doing something good. We were turning decades of cruelty into hope for kids who needed it desperately. 2 years after that, while reading in Grandma Rose's dining room, I took inventory of my life. I had financial security that let me sleep without anxiety about unexpected expenses. I had meaningful work that made me feel useful and competent. I had healthy relationships with people who actually loved and respected me. My parents and I talked regularly. James was my closest family member besides Mom and Dad. Jonathan and I were building something real and lasting. Some family relationships were permanently broken. Uncle Richard and I would never speak again. Brittany and I exchanged occasional pleasant messages, but we'd never be close. Aunt Laura and I maintained distant politeness. That was okay. I'd learned that you don't have to repair every damaged relationship. Some people earn their way out of your life through their actions and choices. I'd survived Grandma Rose's cruelty with my integrity intact. I hadn't become bitter or cruel myself. I'd taken the pain and transformed it into something better. That knowledge felt like the truest measure of success. Jonathan proposed 6 months later during a quiet dinner at my condo. No fancy restaurant or public spectacle. Just him and me and a simple ring he'd chosen carefully. I said yes immediately. We started planning a small wedding with just the people who mattered. My parents would be there. James and his girlfriend. Aunt Laura, because despite everything, she'd made real efforts to understand and change. A few close friends from work. Maybe 20 people total. It was nothing like the huge wedding Grandma Rose had funded for Brittany with 300 guests and a live band. My wedding would be small and simple and completely mine. Every person attending actually loved me and wanted me to be happy. No one was there out of obligation or family pressure. No one would spend the reception whispering about how I didn't deserve this, or comparing me unfavorably to other family members. Jonathan and I would stand in front of people who respected us and say vows that meant something real. That felt absolutely perfect.